It was supposed to be a peaceful afternoon in the quiet suburban neighborhood, a typical day in a perfect world. A little girl, no older than 10, with a disability, was sitting on the sidewalk, her innocent laughter filling the air as she tried to catch a butterfly. The sun was setting, casting a soft glow on the streets. But then everything changed in an instant. A bone-chilling bark shattered the calm. A massive, menacing dog, wild-eyed and snarling, lunged toward the girl with terrifying speed. Her heart raced as she froze, her hands shaking, unable to protect herself. The sound of her frantic cries echoed through the empty street. And just as the dog snapped its jaws at her, something unimaginable happened. What this little girl did next will leave you speechless, and it will change everything you thought you knew about courage and survival. Hold on tight, this story will shock you. Have you ever witnessed a moment when fear turns into something unexpected, when the odds are stacked against you, yet you find a hidden strength you never knew existed? This is one of those moments. Meet Sarah, a young girl who had to face something no child should ever have to endure. Sarah, like so many others, had dreams of playing in a yard, feeling the warmth of the sun, and running around like any other child. But life hadn't been kind to her. Born with a disability that made her movements difficult and her world smaller, Sarah had learned to navigate the world in a way that was different from most kids. But that didn't stop her from dreaming. Living in a quiet suburban neighborhood, Sarah's family thought they had found peace. They moved into a safe and welcoming community, free from the chaos they'd left behind. But little did they know, their world was about to be turned upside down by a woman who had a reputation for being cold and cruel, an HOA Karen. It was a day like any other when Sarah, sitting on the sidewalk, was attacked by her neighbor's dog, a dog known to be uncontrollable and aggressive. But what happened next, as Sarah bravely faced the beast, would send shockwaves through the entire neighborhood. It would leave everyone speechless and change the course of her life forever. Before we dive deeper into this story, let me ask you, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button because you don't want to miss the shocking twists in this story. Let's start from the very beginning. And I'll tell you how Sarah, the unlikeliest of heroes, became a symbol of courage and strength that no one saw coming. The day started like any other in the quiet, suburban neighborhood. The sun hung lazily in the sky, its golden rays casting long shadows over the manicured lawns and carefully trimmed hedges. The sound of children playing, dogs barking, and the distant hum of lawnmowers filled the air, sounds that defined the peace of this picture-perfect community. It was a place where everyone knew each other, where neighbors greeted each other with warm smiles and shared stories over fences. For Sarah, the young girl at the heart of the story, it was supposed to be just another day of enjoying the simplicity of her world. With a disability that made even the simplest tasks a challenge, Sarah had learned to adapt. Her small body, always a bit slower, always a bit more careful, had developed a rhythm of its own. It wasn't easy for her, navigating the world when your body doesn't cooperate with your mind, but Sarah had a heart full of dreams and a spirit that couldn't be broken. On this particular afternoon, Sarah sat on the edge of the sidewalk in front of her family's home. Her favorite toy, a small plastic butterfly she loved to chase, was placed gently in front of her. Her mother had always encouraged her to spend time outdoors when she could, even if it meant just sitting in the sun. The world is full of beauty, Sarah, even if it doesn't always come easy, her mother would say. And so, Sarah spent hours outside, gazing at the clouds, listening to the wind rustle through the trees, and occasionally chasing after that little butterfly, which seemed to fly just a little out of reach every time. But this was not going to be a day of simplicity. This was not going to be just another peaceful afternoon. As Sarah stretched out her hand to touch the fluttering toy, the peaceful sounds of a neighborhood were interrupted by something far more sinister, a loud, bone-chilling bark. Her heart skipped a beat as the sound pierced the air, its volume and urgency sending a shiver down her spine. She looked up, startled, and saw the figure of a large, muscular dog, its eyes fixed on her with an intensity that sent fear racing through her veins. The dog, a German shepherd, wasn't just barking, it was charging toward her with terrifying speed. Sarah's body froze, her heart thudding in her chest. Her disability, which made it hard for her to react quickly, now felt like a prison. She couldn't run. She couldn't hide. The fear she felt was overwhelming, but even worse was the helplessness of knowing she couldn't escape the attack. The dog's growl grew louder, more menacing, as it closed the distance between them. Its teeth were bared, and its eyes, filled with rage, locked onto her like a predator zeroing in on its prey. For a split second, Sarah thought she might pass out from the fear. Her breaths were shallow, her limbs stiff. She could feel the sweat begin to form on her brow as she realized how trapped she was, how alone she was in this moment. No one else was around to help her. She couldn't even stand a run. The only thing she could do was sit there, paralyzed, staring at the approaching dog. But as the dog lunged toward her, its jaws snapping, Sarah did something that no one could have predicted, something that no one, not even her family, had ever expected her to do. She didn't cower. She didn't close her eyes and hope for the best. Instead, Sarah, small, vulnerable Sarah, did something that would forever change the course of this terrifying moment. She screamed. It wasn't a scream of fear, though. It wasn't a scream of panic. No, it was a scream of defiance. It was a scream that came from the very core of her being, a scream that said, "I will not let you hurt me." As the dog closed in on her, its jaws snapping closer and closer, Sarah's voice rang out with an unexpected authority. "Stop! Get away from me!" she yelled, her voice trembling but fierce. The dog hesitated, its body jerking slightly as it seemed to pause mid-air. It was almost as if the dog had been thrown off balance by the force of her words. For a brief moment, the air was filled with nothing but silence. Then a second bark erupted, louder and more furious than the first. But this time, something had shifted. Sarah wasn't just a defenseless child anymore. She had fought back in the only way she knew how. Her scream had bought her time. Time for her father to hear the commotion from inside the house and come rushing outside. Time for the neighbors, who had been used to ignoring the sounds of Karen's dog barking, to start paying attention. Time for everything to change. But before her father could reach her, before the chaos could reach its crescendo, there was a moment, a fleeting moment, where it seemed like time stood still. The dog lunged again, but this time, something unexpected happened. The leash that Karen, the HOA neighbor, had been holding slipped from her hand. In that one brief second, the dog's aggression was no longer under control, and it was free to do whatever it pleased. And what it chose to do was terrifying. The dog's teeth sank into Sarah's arm, and the pressure was so intense that Sarah cried out in pain. Blood trickled from the wound as the dog pulled back, snapping its jaws in a final attempt to lunge again. Sarah's body was racked with fear, but her mind was clear. She knew what she had to do. She had to survive. In that exact moment, Sarah didn't just fight the dog physically, she fought it emotionally. The terror that had consumed her in the beginning was replaced with a determined strength. She was no longer a helpless little girl with a disability. She was someone who, despite everything stacked against her, wasn't about to let a dog or anyone control her life. As the dog pulled back and Sarah's father reached her side, the dog's growl turned into a whimper, a sign that the fight was over. But Karen, her HOA neighbor, was nowhere to be found. She hadn't stepped in to stop the dog. She hadn't called for help. She hadn't even flinched when her dog attacked. Instead, she stood on her porch, watching as Sarah struggled with her own bravery, her own strength, without lifting a finger to intervene. It wasn't just the dog that had attacked Sarah, it was the indifference of the people who were supposed to keep her safe. And that was when everything changed. The world Sarah had known, where her biggest challenge was simply trying to be like everyone else, was ripped apart in an instant. This attack would lead to a battle far greater than just the one with Karen's dog. It would be a battle for justice, for survival, and most importantly for Sarah to prove that no one, not even an HOA Karen, could break her. But for now, Sarah's father rushed to her side, and the neighbors started to gather around. A storm was coming, and in this storm, nothing would ever be the same again. The sun had been dipping lower in the sky, casting a warm orange glow across the neighborhood when the tranquility of the afternoon was shattered by an ear-piercing bark. Sarah froze. The toy butterfly, still in her hand, was forgotten as her attention snapped to the sound. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She knew the bark all too well, the deep, menacing growl that came from Karen's dog. Max wasn't like the other neighborhood dogs. He was bigger, stronger, and had a reputation for being aggressive, especially when Karen wasn't around to keep him in check. But today, there was no Karen in sight. And Max, it seemed, had found a new target. Sarah's heart began to race as she looked up, her eyes wide with terror. She tried to push herself up, but her disability, which made her movements slow and uncoordinated, held her in place. Panic flooded her system, a cold sweat beating on her forehead as the dog's furious barks grew louder, closer, more intense. She had always been cautious around Max. Even from the safety of her own yard, she had learned to avoid him. But today was different. Today, Max wasn't just barking from behind a fence. Today, he was free, and he was coming straight for her. Max's large form charged across the yard next door, his powerful legs eating up the distance between them with alarming speed. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized there was nowhere to go. Her movements felt sluggish, as if her body had turned to stone. Her disability, which had always made her slower than the other kids, was now the one thing that was keeping her from escaping. Her legs refused to obey her mind, and she couldn't get away. Max was getting closer. The sound of his paws slamming against the pavement was like thunder, each step a reminder of how little time she had left. Her eyes frantically scanned the area, looking for anything, anyone who could help. But the street was empty. The neighbors were inside, oblivious to the impending danger. The quiet suburban life that had once felt so safe now felt like a prison, isolated, silent, and unforgiving. As Max closed the gap between them, Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She could hear the dog's growl, low, guttural, and full of menace. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was trapped. The dog lunged at her, teeth bared. Sarah screamed, a sharp cry of pure terror. But it was drowned out by the thunderous bark that followed. Her arms shot up, instinctively trying to protect herself, but it was too late. Max's jaws clamped down on her left arm with a force that made her gasp in pain. His teeth sank into her flesh, tearing at her skin, and the force of the attack sent her sprawling backward onto the concrete. A wave of agony washed over her. She could feel the hot sting of blood dripping down her arm, and her head spun. The world around her seemed to blur, the edges of her vision darkening. She had never felt so helpless, so small. The pain was almost unbearable, but what terrified her more was the complete lack of control. She couldn't run, she couldn't fight back, and she couldn't even cry out properly. She was paralyzed by fear, by her own limitations. But just as the dog's powerful jaws tried to tighten around her, something deep inside Sarah stirred. A sense of survival, an unspoken strength she didn't even know she had. She wasn't going to let this dog overpower her. Not today. Not like this. With a sudden burst of willpower, Sarah pushed the dog away. It wasn't much, just a feeble shove, but it was enough to break its hold on her for a split second. Max snapped his jaws again, but this time he missed. Sarah gasped, her breathing shallow, her heart still hammering in her chest. That brief moment of space was enough for Sarah to think clearly. With all the strength she could muster, she scrambled to her feet, ignoring the pain in her arm. Blood stained her shirt, and her legs felt like jelly, but she managed to steady herself. She had to get away. She had to survive. But before she could take another step, she saw him. Her father, Tom, Sarah's father, had been inside the house when the attack started. He'd been sitting at his desk, working on his laptop, when he heard the distant barks, followed by Sarah's frantic screams. The terror in her voice cut through the walls of their home, and without thinking, he rushed outside. He didn't even stop to grab his shoes. He just ran, his heart pounding in his chest, desperate to reach her before it was too late. By the time he reached the front yard, the sight that greeted him was every parent's nightmare. Sarah was standing, shaky and bloodied, trying to push the dog away. Max, however, wasn't backing down. He circled her, his teeth still bared, growling menacingly. "Sarah!" Tom shouted, his voice a mix of anger and fear. His eyes locked onto the dog. He had seen Max before, but never like this. The dog had always been a nuisance, loud, aggressive, and overbearing, but never outright dangerous. Now, Tom realized just how wrong he'd been. Max wasn't just a loud neighbor's dog. He was a threat, a real, terrifying threat. Without a second thought, Tom ran toward the dog, his mind clouded with rage. He grabbed a nearby broom that was lying on the porch and swung it at Max, shouting for the dog to back off. The broom connected with the dog's side, sending Max yelping back in surprise. But the attack was far from over. Max, enraged by the unexpected assault, turned on Tom, his eyes flashing with fury. He lunged again, aiming for Tom's leg, but Tom was ready. He ducked and swung the broom again, this time hitting Max hard in the head. The dog staggered, its aggressive energy momentarily faltering. But just as Tom thought he had the situation under control, he heard something even worse. From the other side of the yard, he heard a voice that he knew all too well. It was Karen. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. Her cold eyes narrowed as she assessed the situation. The anger in Tom's chest boiled over. But before he could confront her, Karen called out in a mocking tone, "Get that thing under control, Tom. You're making a scene." Tom's blood ran cold. It was as if Karen didn't even care that her dog had attacked his daughter. It was as if she didn't care at all. But what Sarah didn't know as she stood there, trembling, blood dripping from her arm, was that this was just the beginning. The fight was far from over, and the real battle, one for justice, for safety, and for the truth, was about to begin. As Max was finally pulled away by Karen, Tom knelt down to his daughter, tears welling in his eyes. He gently touched her arm, trying to comfort her, but the look on her face was one he would never forget. Sarah, despite the pain, gave him a small, brave smile. She hadn't given up, and neither would he. But Karen, standing at the edge of her porch, simply turned her back and disappeared inside, leaving the wreckage of the moment behind. And as Tom held his daughter, he knew this wouldn't be the last time Karen's actions would cause harm. But he would make sure it would be the last time she got away with it. The quiet suburban neighborhood, once a symbol of peace and tranquility, had now become a battleground. What was supposed to be a safe place for Sarah and her family was marred by the attack. Sarah, sitting on the front step, her arm bandaged tightly by her father, could barely comprehend the pain. Her skin was still raw, the bite marks from the dog stinging every time she moved. But the emotional wounds, the ones that cut the deepest, were still festering. It wasn't just the attack that had shaken her, it was the indifference that followed, the way the entire neighborhood seemed to shrug it off as just a dog incident. Tom, her father, had a knot of fury in his stomach as he looked at his daughter. He couldn't just let this go. He couldn't let Karen off the hook, no matter how much she seemed to dismiss the severity of the situation. The attack wasn't just a bad dog moment. It was a vicious assault, one that should never have happened. And Karen's lack of accountability only made it worse. "Are you okay, sweetie?" Tom asked, his voice strained but trying to remain calm for her sake. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She was staring at the ground, her small body shaking slightly from the pain. The tears she'd held back were now spilling freely, but not from fear or sadness. No, these tears came from the deep frustration that had built up inside her. She was angry. Angry at the dog. Angry at Karen. Angry that she couldn't even enjoy a simple afternoon without it turning into a nightmare. "I'll make sure Karen understands that this won't be ignored," Tom said firmly, standing up and pacing around the porch. His voice was unwavering, but his hands trembled slightly. He didn't want to show it, but his heart ached for his daughter, who had become a target for no reason other than the fact that she was there. Tom took a deep breath. The first step was clear. He had to get help. But help wasn't going to come easy in this community. This wasn't just about dealing with Karen's dog. This was about dealing with the woman herself. Karen wasn't just a neighbor, she was a part of the HOA board, a position that gave her influence over the entire community. And that influence, Tom knew, wasn't something she was going to just relinquish because of a little dog incident. He grabbed his phone, staring at it for a long moment before dialing the number of the local animal control. His fingers shook as he pressed the call button. As the phone rang, his thoughts were already running a mile a minute, trying to figure out how he could force Karen to take responsibility. But the voice on the other end of the phone did little to reassure him. Animal Control, how can I assist you today? The voice was flat, professional, almost robotic. I'm calling about an attack that just happened. A neighbor's dog attacked my daughter. It was unprovoked, and the dog caused serious injury to her arm. Tom said, his voice tight with restrained anger. I need immediate assistance. The woman on the phone responded calmly, but Tom could hear the skepticism in her tone. Can you describe the situation a little more? Where are you located? Tom's frustration grew. I'm at 102 Maple Street. The dog belongs to Karen Matthews, a member of the HOA board. The dog was running loose and attacked my daughter on our own property. My daughter is injured, and the dog should not be allowed to roam freely. The woman paused, and for a brief moment, Tom thought she was going to brush him off. But then, finally, she said, I'll send someone over as soon as possible. But I must remind you that for us to take action, there must be proof of aggression, either a history of prior incidents or if the dog is a danger to others. Tom clenched his jaw. I don't need proof. The attack just happened. My daughter is bleeding right now. We're in danger. We need action. After a few moments of silence, the woman relented. Understood. We'll be there soon to assess the situation. The call ended, but Tom's heart didn't settle. He couldn't wait for animal control to arrive. He couldn't just sit around while Karen's dog remained a threat to his family. He had to make sure this didn't get swept under the rug. But how? That's when he remembered something: neighbors. The very people who had seen Karen's dog roam freely, who had been silent witnesses to its behavior, were also the people who could back his claims. Maybe they weren't all as complicit as Karen. Maybe they would help. He walked across the yard and knocked on the door of the house next door. A middle-aged couple, the Parkers, answered, their faces concerned but hesitant. Tom, is everything okay? Mrs. Parker asked, her eyes drifting towards Sarah, still sitting on the porch, clutching her arm. No, Tom said, his voice sharp. My daughter was attacked by Karen Matthews' dog, and I need your help. I need you to tell me if you've seen that dog act aggressively before. Mrs. Parker looked uncomfortable, her eyes darting to her husband. Mr. Parker stepped forward. We've seen the dog running loose a few times. It's never been as bad as today, but there's definitely been some incidents. The dog has a tendency to bark and lunge at anyone who comes near. Karen doesn't care. She never leashes him or keeps him in her yard. Tom's pulse quickened. Exactly what I thought. This isn't just an isolated incident. I need your testimony, both of you. We need to make sure this never happens again. The Parkers exchanged looks, then nodded reluctantly. We'll help, Mr. Parker said, his voice quiet but firm. Tom's heart lifted slightly. This was the start of something. He wasn't alone in this fight. The next stop was the house across the street. The Daniels family had lived in the neighborhood for years and knew the community well. Tom approached their door with a sense of urgency, knocking 3 times before the door opened. Tom, what's going on? Mr. Daniels asked, stepping out onto the porch. His eyes quickly darted to Sarah, and his face softened in concern. It's Karen's dog, Tom said, his voice still tense with anger. Max attacked my daughter. I need your help. I need to know if you've seen that dog act out before. Mr. Daniels' face tightened. You're not the only one. That dog has chased my kids twice in the past month. I've seen him get aggressive with other neighbors too, but Karen's not the kind of person who listens. I've tried to talk to her about it, but she always brushes it off. Tom nodded, his frustration boiling over. We need to stand together on this. We can't let her get away with it again. She has to be held accountable for what happened. Mr. Daniels hesitated for a moment before giving a reluctant nod. "You have my support, whatever you need." With two neighbors willing to stand with him, Tom felt a glimmer of hope. This was no longer just his word against Karen's. It was the truth backed by the voices of the community, and they were ready to fight back. But Karen wasn't backing down. Tom could feel it in his bones. She would do everything in her power to avoid taking responsibility. And he knew the battle was only just beginning. As he returned to his daughter, sitting silently on the porch, he vowed that he wouldn't stop until justice was done. He would make sure Karen faced the consequences of her actions. Because this wasn't just about the dog. This was about standing up for his daughter, for every parent who feared the same thing, and for the integrity of their neighborhood. The fight for justice had only just begun, and Tom was ready to take it all the way. The night fell, but the tension in Tom's chest only grew heavier as he sat by Sarah's side. The bandages on her arm had been changed, but the physical pain seemed to have faded into the background as the emotional toll began to take its place. Her face, once filled with curiosity and wonder, now bore the weight of fear and hurt. No child should ever have to experience what Sarah had, and Tom could see it in her eyes. The way she looked at the front door, half expecting Karen to come knocking, half hoping that the nightmare would end. But Tom knew better. This wasn't going to be over quickly. He could feel it in his bones. Karen wasn't the type of person to admit fault, much less apologize. The whole situation reeked of entitlement, the kind that came with being on the HOA board, with power that let people get away with anything including negligence. The next morning, Tom called his lawyer. There was no more room for waiting. There was no more room for kindness or understanding. His daughter had been attacked, and he wasn't going to let Karen just sweep it under the rug. If the HOA wouldn't act, if Karen wouldn't act, then it was time for him to take matters into his own hands. The lawyer, a sharp and experienced woman named Linda, listened intently to his account of the incident. After a long pause, she spoke with authority. "We have a case, Tom. Not only did the dog attack your daughter, but Karen has a history of allowing her dog to run free. This is neglect. We can file for a restraining order, demand the dog be put down, and seek damages for medical bills and emotional distress." A sense of relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, harsh realization. "It's not just about the dog," Tom said quietly. "It's about Karen. It's about her attitude. If she gets away with this, it'll only get worse." Linda's voice was steady. "We'll deal with her too. You're not in this alone. We'll use every resource we have to make sure this is handled." Tom spent the rest of the morning gathering witness statements from the neighbors who had agreed to help. Each one corroborated the same story. Karen's dog had been a problem for months, and despite numerous complaints to the HOA, nothing had been done. Max was allowed to roam freely, and every time he caused trouble, Karen either denied it or made excuses. It was clear that she believed her position on the board granted her immunity from responsibility. But Tom wasn't going to let that happen. The next step was to confront the HOA. Tom had been a member of the community for years, and like many homeowners, he'd paid his dues without much thought. He had always believed in the purpose of the HOA, keeping the neighborhood looking neat and orderly, enforcing rules that kept everyone safe. But now, sitting at the table with the other members of the HOA board, he realized just how much those rules had been used to protect people like Karen. The meeting room was filled with people, but Tom's eyes were locked on Karen, sitting at the far end of the table. She had a smug expression on her face, her arms crossed in defiance as she leaned back in her chair. Her dog, Max, had caused the harm, but somehow she still seemed unbothered. As the meeting went on, Tom could feel his anger bubbling beneath the surface. Every time the board members spoke, they sidestepped the issue, brushing off his concerns like they didn't matter. It was clear that they were all too afraid of upsetting Karen, too willing to let her continue to make excuses. Finally, Tom couldn't hold back anymore. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the room. The room fell silent, and every eye turned to him. "This is not just about a dog running loose. This is about accountability. My daughter was attacked, and Karen has done nothing to stop it. You have the power to act, but you choose to turn a blind eye. I won't let this slide, and I won't let you protect her just because she's on the board. There was a tense pause, and Karen's smug expression faltered for just a moment. But she quickly recovered, leaning forward and addressing Tom with feigned calmness. It's not that simple, Tom. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. My dog is just playful. You're overreacting. Tom could feel his blood boil. Playful? You've allowed your dog to terrorize this neighborhood for months. If you won't take responsibility, I'll make sure the whole neighborhood knows exactly what you've done. He didn't wait for a response. Turning on his heel, he stormed out of the room, his mind racing. The fight was just beginning, and he knew that Karen wouldn't back down easily. But he wasn't going to let her win. Not now. Not after what she'd done to Sarah. The next few days were a blur of paperwork, legal meetings, and calls to animal control. Tom had filed for a restraining order against Karen's dog, but Karen's refusal to comply made the process more complicated than it needed to be. She dismissed every attempt to resolve the issue amicably, resorting to her usual tactic of brushing it off as a misunderstanding. But Tom wasn't buying it anymore. Every time she spoke, it only reinforced his determination to take action. By the end of the week, the pressure was mounting. The community had rallied behind Tom and Sarah. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out before were now coming forward, offering their support and sharing their own experiences with Karen's negligence. The local news had even picked up the story, broadcasting the details of the attack and the growing frustration with the HOA's failure to act. It was no longer just a personal issue, it had become a community issue, a fight for justice that reached far beyond their front door. Tom's lawyer, Linda, had arranged for a public hearing with the HOA board. The stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about getting Karen's dog removed, it was about holding her accountable for the damage she had caused, for the lives she had affected with her disregard for safety. The hearing would be a chance for the community to make their voices heard and demand change. On the day of the hearing, the room was packed. The air was thick with tension, but Tom stood tall, his eyes focused on Karen as she sat at the front, her expression cold and calculating. She had no idea what was coming. Tom knew that this was his chance, his moment to make sure that his daughter's pain wasn't in vain. When his turn came to speak, Tom took a deep breath, his voice steady and strong. My daughter is not just another casualty of an irresponsible pet owner. She's a victim of a system that protects the powerful and disregards the vulnerable. I won't allow that to happen. I will fight for my daughter, for every child in this neighborhood, and for the truth. Karen's dog attacked my daughter, and it's time for her to face the consequences. For the first time, Karen's expression flickered, her facade cracking, if only for a moment. But Tom wasn't finished. I will not stop until justice is served. With that, the room erupted in applause. The community, once divided, had come together. The tide was turning, and Tom knew that Karen's days of getting away with her negligence were numbered. As the hearing concluded, the board members looked at each other, clearly shaken by the mounting pressure. Karen remained silent, but it was clear that she was losing control. Tom had won the battle, but the real fight, getting justice for Sarah, was still ahead. And this time, Karen wouldn't be able to hide. The sun rose on a new day, but the aftermath of the attack on Sarah hung heavy in the air, an invisible storm cloud lingering over the quiet neighborhood. The events of the past week had set something in motion, something that could no longer be ignored. What had started as a simple dog attack had now spiraled into a community-wide scandal, one that was forcing everyone to take a long, hard look at the truths they'd been willing to overlook for far too long. The first ripple of change came the morning after the hearing. The media had picked up the story, broadcasting it on local news stations, and soon the story spread like wildfire across social media platforms. The headline, HOA Karen's dog attacks disabled girl, community rallies for justice, was impossible to miss. People from across the city, even from neighboring towns, began commenting, sharing, and demanding action. The story was no longer just a personal one for Tom and his family. It had become a rallying cry for anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of authority, for anyone who had ever been ignored, dismissed, or silenced. Tom sat at the kitchen table, his phone buzzing relentlessly with notifications. Every time he checked it, there was another message of support, another comment calling for Karen's accountability. At first, the influx of messages had overwhelmed him, but as the day wore on, he realized just how much momentum this story had gained. People were listening. People were angry. And it wasn't just about the dog anymore. It was about the systemic apathy that allowed people like Karen to continue to act with impunity. Sarah, sitting next to him, watched him scroll through the messages, her wide eyes filled with both surprise and confusion. She hadn't fully grasped the impact of what had happened, but she could feel the change, the outpouring of support, the messages of hope. It was all a little overwhelming for her. The pain in her arm had started to subside, but the emotional scar was still fresh, and now, with the world watching, it was clear that things would never be the same. "Look, sweetie," Tom said, showing her the screen. "People are supporting us. They want justice for you." Sarah didn't say anything for a moment. She was still processing everything: the dog, the pain, the fear, and now this flood of attention. But slowly, a small smile spread across her face. "They want to help me, Daddy?" Tom nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "Yes, sweetheart. And we're going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Outside, the community had started to take action too. People who had been hesitant to speak out before were now coming forward, signing petitions, and attending town meetings to demand changes. The neighborhood, once divided by fear and silence, was coming together in a way Tom had never seen before. It wasn't just about holding Karen accountable, it was about making sure the HOA and everyone in the community understood that they couldn't turn a blind eye to something like this again. The momentum continued to build, with a growing number of residents voicing their concerns. A petition circulated calling for the immediate removal of Karen from the HOA board, as well as a stricter set of regulations for pet ownership in neighborhood. It was clear that the attack on Sarah had exposed more than just one woman's negligence. It had revealed a deep-seated issue within the community, a lack of accountability, a culture of inaction, and an unwillingness to stand up when it mattered most. Tom, encouraged by the public support, decided to attend the next HOA meeting. He wasn't sure what to expect, whether the board members would continue to defend Karen or whether they would finally take responsibility for their inaction. But one thing was clear: the pressure was mounting, and it was no longer just a matter of whether Tom could get justice for his daughter. It had become about making sure that no other child had to go through what Sarah had endured. When the day of the meeting arrived, Tom and Sarah were ready. They weren't just going to sit there and let Karen get away with her behavior again. This time, they had the support of the community, and they weren't going to back down. As they walked into the meeting room, they were met with an unexpected sight. The board members, including Karen, were already sitting at the table, their faces grim. The room was quieter than usual, the air thick with tension. Tom took a seat at the front, his eyes scanning the room. Karen, as usual, was sitting at the far end of the table, her arms crossed and her eyes narrowed in defiance. But something was different. This time, it wasn't just Tom against Karen. The entire community was watching. They were all here to hold Karen accountable. The meeting started, and as expected, Karen immediately tried to brush off the situation. She began to speak in her usual dismissive tone, claiming that the whole incident had been blown out of proportion and that the dog was harmless. But as she spoke, her voice was met with silence. The usual supporters of hers, those who had once turned a blind eye to her actions, were now strangely quiet. One by one, the neighbors who had come to Tom's defense stood up. Mr. Daniels, who had witnessed the dog's aggression before, spoke up first. "I've seen Max charge at children before. This isn't the first time, and I'm sure it won't be the last if something isn't done." Mrs. Parker, who had seen the dog running loose on several occasions, was next. "Karen has been warned multiple times about her dog. The HOA was made aware of the situation, but nothing was done. My family and I are not safe living next to her." The voices kept coming, one after another, each person adding their own testimony about Karen's negligence. It was clear now that Karen's reputation had been shattered. Her indifference had caught up with her, and the weight of the truth was finally settling in. But Karen didn't back down. Her face turned bright red with anger as she shot daggers at Tom, but the community had already made its decision. The more she denied the truth, the more the people around her realized how much damage she had caused. Finally, Tom stood up, his voice calm but filled with purpose. This isn't just about a dog. It's about accountability. It's about making sure that this community is a place where families feel safe, where children can play outside without fear. And it's about making sure that no one gets away with negligence like this again. The room was silent. The tension was palpable. And then, slowly, one of the board members spoke. We've heard the community's concerns, and we've come to a decision. Karen Matthews is hereby removed from her position on the HOA board, effective immediately. We will also implement new, stricter rules for pet ownership in this neighborhood, including mandatory leash laws and stricter penalties for irresponsible pet owners. The room erupted into applause, and Tom felt a wave of relief wash over him. This wasn't just a victory for him and Sarah, it was a victory for the entire community. For the first time in what felt like forever, the neighborhood was united in a common cause, justice. But Karen, sitting in her chair, was still seething. She stood up, her hands clenched into fists. "This isn't over," she spat, her voice filled with venom. "I'll make sure you all regret this." But no one in the room paid her any mind. The damage had been done. Karen's reign of fear and indifference had come to an end. As Tom and Sarah left the meeting, they were greeted by their neighbors who cheered and clapped. The weight that had settled over Tom's shoulders for so long had finally lifted. He had fought for his daughter, for his family, and for every family in the neighborhood. And they had won. But as they walked home, Tom couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet determination. This wasn't just the end of a single story, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where people stood up for what was right no matter the cost. And as long as he had the support of his community, Tom knew that he would keep fighting for justice no matter what. The dust had barely settled from the HOA meeting, but the aftermath was far from over. Despite Karen's removal from the board and the new pet regulations in place, Tom knew this was not just about seeing the policy change or Karen's temporary defeat. The real challenge now lay in ensuring that Sarah's traumatic experience, one that had shaken their entire family to its core, didn't get lost in the shuffle. This was about more than holding Karen accountable. This was about ensuring that no one, especially a vulnerable child like Sarah, would ever have to endure the same kind of negligence again. The community had rallied together, but Tom couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration. The victory felt hollow. Yes, Karen was removed, and the HOA had acted, but what about Sarah? What about the emotional scars that went far deeper than the bite on her arm? What would it take to make sure that the fear she now carried, the anxiety of even walking outside, didn't become her new reality? He sat at the kitchen table, watching Sarah quietly draw on a piece of paper. Her face, once so full of life and curiosity, now held a distant, cautious look. She wasn't the same child she had been before the attack, and Tom knew it. There was no way around it. The only way forward was to address the pain, both physical and emotional, and make sure she felt safe again. That meant taking one more step. He wasn't done yet. "Sarah," he said, his voice soft but firm, as he looked up from his phone. "I think it's time we do something big, something that will make a difference for you and for everyone else." Sarah looked up from her drawing, a bit surprised. "What do you mean, Daddy?" Tom smiled, trying to keep the conversation light despite the weight of the moment. "I want us to make sure that what happened to you is remembered. I want people to know that it's not just about a dog. It's about justice, safety, and what happens when we stand up for each other." Her eyes brightened with a flicker of understanding, her small voice hesitant, but hopeful. "You mean like a big story? A story about me?" Tom nodded. "Yes, sweetie. A story that tells everyone what happened and why it matters. It wasn't just about pressuring the HOA or getting Karen to face legal consequences anymore. It was about empowering Sarah, about giving her a voice and letting her tell her own story." Tom had learned that much through this whole process. It was never enough to fight for someone else's justice. They had to be part of the fight. They had to reclaim their narrative. Within days, Tom had arranged for a local news outlet to interview Sarah. It wasn't an easy decision, but Tom knew it was the right one. The interview would be a powerful way for Sarah to speak out, not just as a victim, but as someone who had triumphed over fear. He also knew it would be a chance to send a message to the community that things had to change, and they had to change now. The day of the interview arrived, and Sarah was nervous. Tom could tell that the idea of being in front of a camera, sharing her story with strangers, made her feel exposed. But as he sat beside her in the living room, he could see the courage beginning to rise within her. She wasn't just the scared little girl anymore. She was someone who was ready to stand up for herself, to tell the world what had happened, and to make sure it didn't happen again. The reporter arrived, a woman named Jessica, who had been following the story from the beginning. She was warm, approachable, and put Sarah at ease immediately. The camera crew set up, and the room became a little more formal, the lights too bright, the air too thick with anticipation. But Jessica knew how to break the tension. She started the interview with simple, open-ended questions. "So, Sarah, can you tell me what happened that day?" Jessica asked gently. Sarah hesitated at first, but Tom gave her a reassuring nod. "Just take your time, sweetie." And then, slowly, Sarah began to speak. "Well, I was sitting outside, and I was playing with my butterfly toy," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I heard the barking, and I looked up and saw Max running toward me. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't run, and I was scared." Tom watched her as she spoke. It wasn't easy for her to relive the experience, but there was strength in her voice now. She wasn't just recounting an attack, she was reclaiming control over what had happened. "I tried to push him away, but he bit me," Sarah continued, her eyes now on the floor. "It hurt so much, but I screamed, and then my daddy came." Tom's heart swelled with pride. His little girl had found her voice. It wasn't the loudest, and it wasn't the bravest, but it was real, and that was all that mattered. He reached over and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. Jessica continued with the interview, asking Sarah about how she felt now and what she wanted to see happen. Sarah's answers were filled with honesty and wisdom beyond her years. She talked about the fear that stayed with her, the anxiety that followed her even in the safety of her own home, and the anger that had boiled up when Karen refused to take responsibility. But Sarah also talked about hope. "I don't want other kids to be scared like I was. I want people to know that if you speak up, things can get better." That was the moment the story shifted. Sarah's words weren't just words anymore. They were a call to action. Tom watched the interview unfold with a mix of awe and deep emotion. He had known that Sarah was resilient, but hearing her speak so clearly about her experience made him realize just how much strength she had. It wasn't just about being strong in the face of fear, it was about refusing to let fear dictate the future. By the time the interview was over, the sense of accomplishment was palpable. Sarah had taken control of her narrative, and Tom felt a deep sense of pride. This was more than just about seeking justice for her. It was about giving her the power to shape the story, to share it on her own terms. As the crew packed up and left, Tom turned to Sarah. "You did amazing, sweetie. You're going to help so many people with your story." Sarah gave him a shy smile, her eyes still reflecting the uncertainty of what she had just done. But there was something different now, something that hadn't been there before. "I was scared," she admitted softly, "but I think it's okay. I think I can be brave." Tom knelt down beside her, brushing her hair back gently. "You've always been brave, Sarah. You just needed to see it for yourself." The interview aired that night, and the response was overwhelming. People from all over the city reached out to Tom and Sarah, offering their support, sharing their own stories of overcoming fear and standing up for justice. The story sparked conversations about accountability, about the power of community, and about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it feels impossible. As the weeks passed, things slowly began to return to normal. Sarah still had moments of fear, moments when the memories of the attack crept up on her. But she was no longer defined by the fear. She was defined by her courage. For Tom, the battle wasn't just about winning in the courtroom or the HOA boardroom. It was about seeing his daughter reclaim her confidence. It was about knowing that, in the end, she was stronger than the circumstances that had tried to break her. And for the community, Sarah's story became a turning point. It was a reminder that change doesn't come from sitting quietly and hoping things will get better. Change comes from standing up, speaking out, and refusing to accept the status quo. The story didn't end with the interview. It continued in every conversation that followed, in every person who saw Sarah's courage and found the strength to take their own stand. The world wasn't just a little bit safer because of the actions that had been taken, it was a little bit braver. Tom smiled as he watched Sarah play outside again, this time without fear. She had found her voice, and in doing so, she had given others the courage to find theirs too. "Go on, sweetie," he called out. "You're free to play. It's your world now." And for the first time in weeks, Sarah ran toward the butterfly, her laughter ringing out into the neighborhood. The future, for the first time, felt bright. As Sarah's story reaches its conclusion, we are reminded of the power of standing up for what's right. It only takes one voice, one person, one act of courage to spark a change. Sarah faced fear, pain, and adversity, and she emerged stronger because she refused to stay silent. But the fight for justice doesn't end here. If you believe in what's right, if you believe that every child deserves safety and every community deserves accountability, share the story. Let others know that we can make a difference, that we can stand up against negligence, and that we can create a safer, more just world for everyone. If you've been inspired by Sarah's bravery, I encourage you to leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and share your own story or your thoughts on how we can continue to push for change. Together, we have the power to ensure that no one ever has to face what Sarah did again. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories, more community action, and more ways we can inspire each other to do better. Remember, your voice matters. It's time to make it heard. Thank you for standing with Sarah and for standing up for what's right. The fight for justice never ends, and it begins with us.